Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We are less than 48 hours into the month of October, and already it has been full of surprises. As I'm sure all of you know, last night news broke that President Trump and his wife Melania had been exposed to COVID-19 and are indeed infected, along with a number of the White House staff, several senators. I think Vice President Pence is not, that we know of. So far, I think we're still waiting on the results of the Bidens. What a crazy news day it's been. This, of course, comes on the heels of the New York Times story releasing information regarding the president's tax returns. And, of course, just to highlight what a crazy month it's been already, or a crazy time frame in COVID times. That tax story was 5 days ago. It was within the same week, and it feels like it's been at least a month. So there's a lot to talk about. None of that stuff has anything to do with Oklahoma politics. It does have a bearing on the election, but more importantly, here at home, we, in our commitment to trying to keep Oklahoma voters as informed as we can about some of the issues, we are going to talk about one of the state questions that's on the ballot today, State Question 814. As many of you, hopefully our listeners and those who are watching this live episode, may have already received their ballot. I have mine sitting here next to me. Actually, I filled it out yesterday and need to either drop it off or drop it in the mail. So we've got some folks on the show today from both sides of this issue of State Question 814, which deals with the Tobacco Endowment Settlement Trust, or TSET, and the funding related to that. And we'll get into it from both sides and kind of hear the perspectives of people that support it and those that oppose it. But first, I want to bring on the show my other two co-hosts, Bailey Perkins. Hello, Bailey.
Hey, Andy.
How are you?
Doing good. Can't complain. So.
Great. Well, I mean, in 2020, we can always complain.
True.
It doesn't do any good. And Scott Melson, how are you, sir? You are muted. That's how you're doing.
There we go. I'm good, man. How are you?
Great. I'm good. Thanks for being here.
Did you did you say the president got COVID?
I did say that.
How could that possibly have happened?
Well, it's going around these days. It's
Really?
a bug that's going around.
And Joe Biden tested negative. So
Yeah.
that's what we
That's
did.
right. However,
So far.
I mean, yeah, he's going to have to, because he was just exposed the other night, and so they're
Yeah.
going to have to retest a bunch. What a crazy week. I mean, I think we've all anticipated something like this could happen, but the fact that it's happening in October, I've already seen someone early in the week say, man, I didn't expect this for an October surprise, and then this happened, and it's only the 2nd of the month. So it'll be a very long month in the midst of a very long year. But yeah, a month from tomorrow is election day, right? So it's gonna be very long and also go by very quickly, I anticipate.
Absolutely.
So as we get into this discussion about State Question 814, I'm going to start by reading the ballot title of the measure, and then we'll get into the discussion. And welcome some guests on here. So the words, the paragraph you will see on your ballot says, this measure amends Section 40 of Article 10 of the Oklahoma Constitution. It modifies the amount of the annual tobacco settlement payments to the state to be deposited into the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust Fund. It modifies the amount of the annual tobacco settlement payments to the state to be deposited into the Tobacco Settlement Fund for appropriation by the Oklahoma legislature. It specifies that deposits into the Tobacco Settlement Fund shall be appropriated and expended to draw down federal matching funds for the Medicaid program. Okay, well, that's clear as mud, and now that we're all at least somewhat confused, let's actually
Well, and
talk
before
about.
we bring in our guests,
Yeah.
this is one of the questions that was brought in by the legislature. And so we talked about this a few podcasts ago about the different ways that state questions could arrive on the ballot. The one we're going to be talking about today is one that was brought in by the legislature because it takes a vote of the people to make the changes to TSET, since it was passed by a vote of the people for TSET to be put in place the way that it is. And so
That's right. It's a constitutionally protected fund, thus it requires a constitutional amendment to adjust it. And we're going to start today's episode with a couple of folks who are on the opposition side or opposed to this measure. And then here in about 20 minutes, we will have a member of the legislature, Representative Marcus McIntyre, who's a friend of the pod. We've had him on before, haven't we?
Yeah.
And he'll come on to talk about how this came to be and why it was referred to the ballot. So, on that note, I want to bring on Sarah Riven from the American Heart Association. Hello, Sarah. Thanks for joining us. And also, and then also Matt Glanville from the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. Hello, sir.
Hey, thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.
So, Sarah, I'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about, maybe not where this came from, but what does it mean to you and to the coalition that opposes this, why you have a problem with this measure?
So we know that TSET works. TSET, this originally TSET was set up with the funding structure it has about 20 years ago. And it funds programs across the state, including for tobacco cessation, but also, as I'm sure Matt will talk about, in cancer research, in preventive programming to combat obesity and heart disease. And through the work that they do, they help billions of people in Oklahoma. And so we know that it's really important to continue funding these incredible programs that help all of us and improve our health outcomes. This ballot initiative, by decreasing the money that would go to TSET, would have really serious ramifications for the health outcomes in our state. And we're here today because we know just how important it is that we're out here talking about why this organization is so important and why we stand by them.
Yeah, Sarah, can you give an example of like what are some of the things that people might see that TSET does with this money that like would potentially go away if this measure passes?
Yeah, so the two biggest programs I think the American Heart Association would point to that are relevant to our work, the first is the Quit Line. Their tobacco cessation programming is nationally recognized. The Quit Line is nationally ranked. It helps many Oklahomans quit every single year. And in addition to that, they fund grants across the state, healthy living grants that, like I said, that they go to preventive programming really targeted to combat heart issues, including obesity, diabetes, and other concerns all across our state. I'm going to let Matt answer the question too, just about the work they do to combat cancer, because that's also a really big part of their funding.
Sure. So as Sarah mentioned, TSET funds programs and grants that reduce cancer, heart disease, stroke in Oklahoma. They fund programs on obesity prevention, physical activity, nutrition, the list goes on and on. They actually have a medical loan repayment program that the state uses to recruit physicians in medically underserved areas of the state, both urban areas and rural areas. That's very important to Oklahoma as we seek to improve our overall health ranking. And they're the leading funder, actually, of the Stevenson Cancer Center here in Oklahoma City, which is the only NCI recognized cancer center in the state of Oklahoma. So, as we look at what this measure does, we know that the state needs money to expand Medicaid, but we just don't want them to use our cancer research and tobacco control money to do it.
Yeah, so that's a comment that I think we've heard from a lot of people is, while the measure says it's supposed to be used to fund Medicaid, it doesn't necessarily mean that that money can't be supplanted somewhere else, right? And then we've seen this happen with the lottery and education and a number of other things. And so it sounds like from both of you that the concern here is if they accept this, if this measure is approved, that they might use that money for whatever it is they want, and that the net return to the state in some of these programs that have specific or direct impacts on health outcomes in our state would be compromised because they wouldn't be funded at the same level they have been historically.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We know, again, just how important TSET is. And by taking dollars from TSET, regardless of what the intention for those dollars is, there's more money that the legislature has control over for whatever they may want to do with those dollars.
Yeah, the legislature can find money for expansion through any number of other means. And I think that it's important to emphasize that Medicaid and TSET fall into two fundamentally different categories. Medicaid is obviously a fundamental healthcare program. TSET is a prevention-oriented agency. That's what they do. They fund prevention programs. So in bringing this question before voters, what is being asked of them is to sacrifice the state's investment in prevention in order to fund a fundamental healthcare program that is required to be funded by law, which is just a horrible position to put people in, especially when our state ranks 47th in overall health.
So here's another question. I think supporters of State Question 814 say, well, there's already $1 billion within the endowment. How would you all respond to that as far as that $1 billion being what will be used to fund the programs that you're mentioning?
The way the TSET funding structure works is TSET programs are funded by interest coming from the endowment every year. So they actually take the average of 3 years of what those interest payments look like in order to determine what the budget will be for TSET each year. Those dollars in the endowment, the reason that voters put them there 20 years ago in an endowment instead of appropriating a bigger chunk of that pot of money to the TSET programming every year is because we know that we want those dollars to be there in perpetuity to help us improve health outcomes in Oklahoma, regardless of what the payments coming from the tobacco industry look like. We hope that in the future there's less money coming in from the tobacco industry because the tobacco industry shrinks. That's a hope for our health organizations. Yet we also know that those dollars are critical for all this health programming in Oklahoma that TSET does. And so keeping that $1 billion+ and continuing to add to it is intentional and will help us from here long into the future to continue to improve health outcomes. If we shrink that endowment, that will also mean that the interest payments are less. And so the programming per year would also shrink. Obviously, it's easy to think that $1 billion is a really big amount of money. But again, looking ahead, as money going to that endowment shrinks, that could have huge impact on the programming that TSET executes.
So just as we're talking about this, I think it might be useful to clarify mostly for me, because I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box. But when we're looking at the state question, so you've got the interest, right? You've got the big pot of money, the corpus, right? Like the main endowed fund. This money that's on the state question, where does that come from? Are we pulling money, like are voters saying like we're going to take that $1 billion and we're going to siphon off $100 million every year and fund Medicaid expansion? Are we saying that we're going to take the interest each year and we're going to just spend that, or is part of that going to go to TSET and part of it's going to go to the legislature? What are the actual mechanics of what this would do to the funding on a year-to-year basis?
So that money that comes into TSET on a year-to-year basis is the proceeds from the master settlement agreement with Big Tobacco when states successfully sued tobacco companies 20 years ago to create programs like TSET. So by law, those proceeds can only be used for tobacco prevention programs, cancer research, and other programs that are similarly situated to improve the health of Oklahomans. And 75% of those funds go into the TSET fund currently. And the remaining 25% of those funds are directed to a separate fund for the legislature, which can also direct some of that to the Attorney General. So what State Question 814 would essentially do is reduce the percentage of proceeds that go into that TSET fund on an annual basis from the Master Settlement Agreement from 75% to 25%. So you're looking at a downward adjustment in their annual operating budget from about, let's say, $60 million to $20 million.
Yeah.
All right.
Go ahead, Bailey.
Well, and I do want to note for our listeners that TSET is an acronym that stands for the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust. And so just want to make sure our listeners know what TSET means.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna, when I make our like voter guide for Let's Fix This, which I'm working on, I think this afternoon or tomorrow, I'm gonna make a drawing to kind of draw like what this looks like, because it feels abstract, right? Matt, you did a great job explaining where the money goes in and how it flows out, but the fact that there's two funds that have similar names and what those names are used for, we need like a before and after. And I will appreciate that the election board has not one but two different visual instruction pages that come with your ballot, your absentee ballot this year. Made me think like,
and they're different
you have
colors. So
they are different colors. We need to diagram some of this stuff out so that voters get it. I know that can't be part of the ballot title, but it helps people understand exactly what's happening and gives them a better opportunity to decide if that's good or bad in their eyes.
So is it accurate then to say that this would like essentially flip what it is right now? So like right now, the legislature can appropriate 25% and 75% goes to the TSET budget, and then this would change it so the legislature gets to appropriate 75% and 25% goes to the TSET budget, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the legislature can already appropriate 25%. Why don't they just use that 25% for like the stuff they want to do? Like, is that 25%? Is it preordained what the legislature has to appropriate it for, or can they use it for whatever they want?
So that's a good question to ask Representative McIntyre here in a little bit too. But go ahead.
I will.
That is a good question. But
he's gonna get that question too.
So obviously the idea here is to bring in more money so the legislature can use it to fund Medicaid expansion, right? We know they need this money for Medicaid expansion, and this would produce more. We just don't want to see it coming from this fund. But they are required by law to direct a certain percentage of that money to the Attorney General's Evidence Fund.
Makes sense.
All right.
I know,
ahead,
Sarah and Matt, I know that you are short on time today. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you feel is important for listeners to hear from your side of things?
I have a couple things I want to add, Matt. I don't mean to take the lead on it, but there are a couple of statistics that are really important when I think for people to know when we talk about this issue. The first is the tobacco industry spends $172 million per year on marketing in Oklahoma alone. And by comparison, as Matt alluded to, TSET's budget recently has been about $50 or $50 million. It was $46 million for the current year. And needless to say, that's a huge disparity in terms of the resources that we put into cessation programming and efforts to combat that industry influence. So there's a huge issue there in terms of protecting this programming and making sure we don't let the industry dictate what happens with tobacco use in Oklahoma. The second point I wanted to raise, because we have such poor health outcomes in Oklahoma, we get a lot of questions about TSET maybe doesn't work so well. Again, this program has been around for a long time. I want to point out as well that when we look at states with similar landscapes, similar policies, similar prices for cigarettes, et cetera, Oklahoma has actually cut smoking rates about 10 times faster than in those other states. And we know that that's because of TSET and the work that they do. Like I said, they have a nationally ranked quit line that's incredibly effective. So again, we know that this programming is really valuable, and I just hope voters remember that.
Definitely. That's a great point about TSET's effectiveness in the light of the fact that they're so badly outspent by big tobacco. And I think it's worth noting that, cigarette sales have decreased by, 1 billion packs since 2001. So, they've reduced adult smoking prevalence from around 29% in 2001 to about 20% in 2018. So we know that they're effective. They operate effective programs, and we want to see those programs fully funded.
Yeah. Well, guys, thanks so much. It's been very helpful to me, and I hope it's helpful to our listeners as well. I saw one commenter say that they like pictograms, and so I'll make sure that I draw one of those out. But we'll let you guys get on with your afternoon, your weekend. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Hey,
Thank
thanks
you
for having
very
us.
much.
Have a good day.
All right. Super. Well, that was helpful. I think, in my mind, I always like to have things like the yes, then the no. But it was interesting having the no side first.
Well, and also helping the listeners understand what exactly TSET does, because we hear about the amount of money that goes into this endowment and then they're spending off of the interest. But what exactly do those programs look like? So I appreciate our guests being able to explain the value that those TSET dollars put into medical research and then tobacco cessation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I'll tell you, I refer patients to the quit line all the time. I mean, it's it's awesome. The quit line that they use is fantastic. And one question that I'll have for Representative McIntyre when he comes on here in a second is, I think one of the things that we hear from the legislature frequently is that they, well, depending on who you talk to, is that they ideally like stable sources of revenue, right? Like you don't want to tie something that's critical to fund to a source of revenue that can vary dramatically year to year. This was one of the chief arguments against increasing the gross production taxes on oil and natural gas, is because as prices of those commodities change, production changes and revenues from those taxes can vary year to year. So like we don't want to do something, this was one of the arguments we heard a few years ago, was like, we don't want to raise taxes on raise the gross production tax because it can be so volatile. Right. I don't think that this falls in that exact same category. However, they point out that as more and more people stop using tobacco, the revenues from TSET are gonna drop. Right? Like they're not that pot of money is not going to be there. And we're seeing, because TSET is so effective, we're seeing people stop using tobacco at refreshingly high rates. Also, because the legislature took the step of increasing taxes on cigarettes a couple of years ago, we're also seeing people quit smoking. So this, to me, I guess what I'm alluding to is, why isn't this another one of the temporary fixes that we hear from legislators they don't like? Right? Like,
right. I'd be curious to see what the revenue coming in has been year over year, just to illustrate, again, a pictorial representation to demonstrate that it is a revenue source with diminishing returns.
Love me a good graph, man. Love me a good graph.
Well, especially because we gave, during the no discussion, there was a reference to like a number in the air to give an illustration. It'll be interesting to hear, how much would the legislature receive from TSET in these first years or the first decade or whatever, and then if returns diminish over time, what that could look like as the decrease. So.
Well, and I think the last I saw, it was going to be like 125, 150 million bucks to fund Medicaid expansion, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. That's going to be, and that's probably going to go up, right? Like looking at the current the pandemic, the recession, like all of the things that are happening, we're probably going to have more people on Sooner Care in the near future rather than less, and so that number may go up. So even if this passes, like the legislature is going to have to come up with some serious money from other sources as well, and so I don't know. Like if this is 90% of it, like that's one thing, but if this is 25% of it, then that's not insignificant. But I feel like that changes the argument a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, that's it. And I will put into the chat in just a minute the 2019 or the fiscal year 2019 annual report from TSET, the organization. There's a graph that shows the decline in youth cigarette smokers over the last 15 years, and it's pretty substantial. Nothing in here that shows the budget part overall, but I wonder if like OK Policy or someone has that data that we could find.
You know, David Blatt's got that just like stored in his head somewhere, right?
That's possible.
But he's not with OK Policy anymore.
I mean, he's not, but he still knows it, right? Yeah. We need to have a show where David comes on the whole show is just David on the show, and we just like ask him questions. Like random, hey, David, tell me this. And then he answers it. And like, hey, David, what was the budget for this? And he's like, it's this. And it's just an hour of like us asking David all the stuff that he knows that we don't.
We'll call it Brain Dump with David Blatt.
Right? And you know what? I bet he'd do it too. In all seriousness, because this is probably something he knows. And he is, he's teaching now, which makes me jealous of his students because I feel like David is very gifted at explaining things in a way that makes a lot of sense and makes a lot of sense intuitively to people. So anyway.
Yeah. I would imagine he might be a difficult professor, though.
Well, yeah, but those are the best ones, right?
Fair enough. This is why we're friends, Scott. So earlier, though, Matt mentioned the medical student repayment program or whatever it is. The
Rural Physician Compensation Loan Repayment Program.
There, that's it.
Yep.
That one.
Do you? Yeah, that's ding, 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 ding. As a physician who went through medical school not too long ago, I mean, since TSET's been around, do you personally know folks that have benefited from that program?
Yeah, like so there's folks a lot of times it's folks that are from rural communities and that are maybe intending to go back there, and so it kind of gives them a boost when they're going back to start. I think one of the things they hope is that doctors who were otherwise not considering a move to a rural community or an underserved healthcare area would move there, and I do know some that have done that. I know docs that have grown up their entire life in the city and the suburbs and have wanted to like live in a more rural area for a long time, and that was their plan, and they took advantage of the program. But a lot of them are docs that are returning to their home communities, and that's a program that kind of help them jumpstart their practice because they can take on all the financial considerations that you have when you're starting a practice, especially without the support of the major healthcare system. They can do that without having the added burden of, an average medical school debt that in the U.S. runs about $200,000.
Ooh, that's steep. That's very steep.
Yeah, it's like imagine like trying to start a business while like paying your mortgage and then paying another mortgage and then going to the bank and being like, I would like a loan to start a business, please. My balance sheet has my two mortgages.
Right. And you're basing everything on the potential of future cash flows, which is maybe, is stable. However, I think 2020 has made us question the stability of almost everything, including doctors' salaries, right?
Yeah.
Like it's when hospitals stop doing surgeries, suddenly I think it was an eye-opening experience for a lot of folks in the medical community.
Oh yeah, there's no question. And the other thing is that also it's interesting. I can't remember if I've ranted about this on the show before or not. So I'll take the next 90 seconds before Marcus comes on to rant about it now, because we're seeing, we're in a spike in COVID right now in Oklahoma. We're back up to the highest levels that we've ever been. Our hospital capacity, ICU capacity statewide is about 15%, which is not great. That's all ICU capacity, not COVID specific. And we've heard the governor say over and over again, hospital capacity is fine because if we need to, all we got to do is just, we can just shut down elective procedures again, and then we have all the capacity we need. Like doing that, and I'm not saying it was the wrong thing to do at the time. Like I understand why it happened, but that move alone literally cost thousands and thousands of people across Oklahoma their jobs. Number one. Number two, we have this idea that like because a procedure is elective, that must mean it's unnecessary, right? An elective procedure is not like a nose job is an elective procedure, but like people, I think when they hear, no elective surgeries means that people aren't getting tummy tucks, right? Or they're not getting an eyebrow lift, right? Or they're not getting, whatever. And that's not true, right? There's like having your gallbladder taken out could be an elective surgery, right? Having a suspicious mass in your liver biopsied is an elective procedure, right?
Yeah.
Elective
Or
procedure.
even the example you gave about the nose, maybe that surgery could help somebody breathe better.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great point. I said nose job, and I was like, that's actually not a great example because there's a lot of those that are not simply cosmetic. People like elective healthcare means it's not an emergency. An elective surgery means it's not an emergency, right? It means that like we don't have to do this like right now or risk your death.
Well, and to give an example, like a member of my family had a mass in her breast and needed to have it removed, but it wasn't urgent right then. And this was early on, or I think it was scheduled early on in COVID. And so she elected to wait for a while to see, when it all first happened and everything shut down, we were kind of waiting to see how things were going to shake out. But it was one of those anxiety provoking things because she had to do surgery before she could do radiation. And so like delaying that felt like, this bomb's not going to explode right away. So like, we'll just push it over there. And those are the kind of surgeries that get bumped too, right? Like, scary deal.
Right.
All right. Well, so I think we well covered the opposition side to State Question 814. And so now we're going to talk to a member of the legislature to hear a little bit about how State Question 814 came to be. When it passed in the legislature, it was largely on party line votes. I mean, that's how a lot of stuff goes down up there. And so we'll talk about that and maybe, how it ended up coming to the ballot and why they think that it's the right thing to do, or that at least the people should be the ones to decide on that. Representative McIntyre, I'm going to add you to our stream now. I know you're getting your camera situated. There he is. Hello, sir.
I'm not doing a very good job.
I was trying to buy some time so you can get it. We've all.
Is that good enough?
Did you get it set up there? Yeah, that works.
It's terrible looking. That used my big face in here, but that's okay.
Hey, you're coming through loud and clear, and the picture looks great. So well done.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about how State Question 814 came to originate, how the idea came up, and how it made it to our ballots?
Well, it actually originated in the Senate. This was a Senate, pretty sure it was a joint resolution coming from the Senate. And they were looking for extra funds to fund Medicaid expansion when it comes around. And it's coming. So this is one of the things that they're looking at to help fund Medicaid expansion.
Sure. Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was going to say, so when we talk about Medicaid expansion, why is this one of the vehicles that the legislature wants to use to find those monies?
Well, in their defense, and I'm pretty sure that this was a leadership bill or leadership joint resolution coming from Senate leadership. I think that one reason is because it fits into TSET's mission. And that is healthcare, or tobacco cessation. The ultimate goal is healthcare, and I think that they looked at it and they said, "Hey, this fits with their mission, and what better way for them to make an impact on healthcare in the state of Oklahoma and help funding more access to care."
So there's, money is fungible, right? So like the money coming into the legislature for appropriation, other monies could be used to pay for Medicaid specifically, but it sounds like your understanding is that perhaps in the initial thought process is that Medicaid is obviously healthcare, TSET is healthcare adjacent, it would be part of that. I think one of the critiques that we've heard is that TSET is primarily about preventative issues, right? So preventing cancer and preventing heart disease and those things, whereas Medicaid is, I guess, sick care is what we have in America, right? So it's taking care on the back end. So, and maybe in some ways, those two things aren't necessarily as aligned as one might think.
Well, I think that we can, split hairs as much as we want, but the fact of the matter is, we simply don't have a lot of extra money sitting around, and we certainly don't now. When COVID has made its impact on our state budget. So, we had, I think I've seen, when I was working on Sooner Care 2.0, which, I had probably, Sooner Reporting, I had probably 18 different derivations on how to pay for this. And in almost all of them, TSET was kind of in the footnote as a possible option to help fund it. There's also going to be most likely premium tax on the managed care organizations when the healthcare authority gets done with the RFP for managed care. So that's probably roughly about $60 million. And if you could pick up another 50 from the MSA monies going into TSET pretty reliably every year, that's $110 million pretty much right there. And you've got to come up with 40 some odd million after that. So, it is what it is. But personally, it's going to be really hard to balance our budget next year with the amount of money that we're going to have. I certainly don't believe that using TSET funds is necessarily optimal, but it gets us there, and it gets us there without having to cut any other part of the budget, because it would be pretty much new revenue for us to appropriate. And believe me, every bit of that money will be appropriated to get matching funds for expansion.
Well, and Representative, the folks who are opposed to 814 say that with the loss of funds for granting towards research and different things, that it could harm many of the progress that's been made on different health outcomes in the state. How would the legislature respond to that?
I think that's a fair criticism. It's a really fair criticism. This is not perfect. And I don't think anybody is sitting out here in the legislature or anywhere else, those who know about it, think that this is, like I said, an optimal idea. And could you repeat your complete question?
Yeah. Just how the legislature or even leadership will respond to.
I think that it will jeopardize some of TSET programs, but we have to realize that the corpus of TSET is already over $1 billion. How much bigger do we need that corpus to be? And that's a question that the voters need to decide when they vote. If you go off a pretty much normal year with the stock market of about 8%, if you're looking at index stuff, looking at growth of about 8%, that's $80 million that the TSET corpus is throwing off to TSET every year that they use. And there's another bucket of money there in unrealized gains that I know back when we were in session, it was another $160 to $180 million just sitting there in unrealized gains. There may be some things that we can do to help them get at some of those unrealized gains if they want to cash some of those out. But the important thing for voters to know is that the corpus of the fund is not being touched. And you guys may have already touched on this at the beginning, but the corpus is not being touched. If we were going after the corpus, you would see a big red no from Representative McIntyre, but we're not going after that. We're going after the MSA money that go in every year, because it's super important that TSET be there and be putting out the messaging they're putting out and doing the health initiatives that they're doing. They grant to my local hospital, they grant to a lot of rural hospitals. Stevenson Cancer Center receives a pretty hefty grant from them. And so we may need to restructure some of the things that TSET, they may need to restructure because they're a constitutional entity. But the goal is not to kill what they're doing. The goal is we're not going to have enough money, and we're going to have to find a place to get some more money so we don't have to make it across the board just because of Medicaid expansion.
Sure. So I want to, if I can, I want to play devil's advocate for a minute. Sure. and try to and I'll try to frame this in a way that really is more policy oriented, not to be political. So one of the arguments that I feel like was made a lot when we were talking about education funding a few years ago, and we were talking about oil and gas, like gross production taxes, and what do those need to look like, and talking a lot about how it's really not good policy to try and tie funding for critical services to income streams that have a tendency to be volatile, right? Like gross production taxes that are so dependent on commodity prices and et cetera. And I know that TSET is not the same as that, but as people, because TSET's good at their job and because people quit smoking and like tobacco use is going down, like eventually those monies are going to start to decrease. Like that's not a stable income source that's just going to like remain the same or go up and up and up and up. So, and especially as we look forward and we see like the pandemic, the results in economic conditions, et cetera, I think in the immediate future, more people are going to need sooner care rather than less. So I know we're looking at 150 million ish right now, but that could easily be higher, in the short term. So as we're talking about finding other money, right? I feel like one of the things when we talk about with the legislature trying to like find other funding streams, sometimes, and I'm not saying that you're making this argument, but I've heard other people make this argument like, well, there's just nothing we can do. And I would argue from a policy point, like one thing that could happen is the top marginal income tax rate could go back up by like 1% from some of the cuts that have been made for the last 10 years. And we could raise like $1 billion. And I would, and Andy we can play back the audio. I have said numerous times on this show that like a recession is not the time that anyone wants to raise taxes. Ideally, you'd want to cut taxes. We can't in Oklahoma right now for a variety of reasons. So I'm not arguing from that standpoint. But I think it is pretty clear that even in the midst of this recession, the folks that would be hit with that kind of a tax increase at the very, very top of the income bracket, like those are not the folks that are struggling the most during this time. So from my perspective, a policy, like a better long-term policy would be a small increase on the very top income tax earners. And tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, and Scott, I think this connects to a question that you were asking earlier that I think would tie in for Representative McIntyre. If we know that the cost of Medicaid expansion is going to increase over time, and so if the earnings of the TSET trust decreases, then that means there'll be less money that will be available from that source to cover Medicaid expansion. And so what would the different ideas be of potential ways to continue funding this part of Medicaid expansion should the value of TSET decrease from those returns?
Okay, so there's a lot there. So let's
yes, I apologize.
I know you were asking. You basically said, look, let's look at this from a policy perspective, and which cannot be divorced from politics. It just can't. I mean, let's all be realists for a second, and that we've got super majority Republican control all over the place. It's a 75 in the House to be a 76 vote to raise taxes. I don't think leadership has any desire to raise taxes. The governor doesn't have any desire to raise taxes to fund this. And so they're looking wherever else they can to find money. And quite frankly, I'm a little surprised they didn't go after CLO a little bit too. But
I am too, yeah.
We've had that happen, and I defended CLO because they were wanting to get at another legislator or two, or wanting to get at the corpus of that fund. And again, with TSET, we're not going to corpus, but still, though, I mean, the raising taxes are just going to be a non-starter, whether one believes that's a good policy or not. There's just not enough people willing to put their neck on the block to raise taxes again, especially after 2 years ago we went through it with the largest tax increase in state history. So I wish that politics, we could look at this in a vacuum and say, oh yeah, this would be a really nice idea, but the reality is is that we're Republican controlled through and through. And the last thing a Republican wants to do is ever raise taxes. It may get to if we've really lowballed it that we have to, but.
And you're, I mean, 100%, right? Like the political reality, and I, despite my lofty idealism of trying to frame it in terms of the policy, yeah, I mean the politics are what they are. It's just, you know, I really try when I vote for anything. You know, everybody has partisan considerations, I'm sure, and now more than ever. But I really try to look at ideas and think about what's good policy and what's not. And I'm not here to say that this question is terrible. It's frustrating. It's frustrating to me as somebody who really, one, I mean, I'm a primary care doctor. I really care about good healthcare and access to good healthcare. But two, I really care about good, sustainable public policy. And my fear is that in 2 years or 4 years, you know, hopefully not on Zoom, but the four of us will be having this same conversation talking about well, now we need 300 million for Medicaid, and what are we going to do? Do you see what I'm saying? So that's where
absolutely.
That's where the question comes from.
I have a follow up to that. I think.
And just to your point, Eddie.
Go ahead.
And hold 1 second. And I want to also address what you were talking about on the MSA money being declining revenue. There is always the potential on any of that it will decline as people stop smoking and things like that. But, you know, we've hit it pretty hard, and those MSA funds are coming in pretty reliably every year, about 75 million a year. It shows no sign of really slowing down. I think that's a risk. Albeit right now and for the next 5 or 6 years to be a low risk for that declining very much. And Andy, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. That's an excellent point. I forget what the sentence was that made me think of this, but back in the spring, the legislature passed funding for Medicaid expansion, right? That the governor ultimately vetoed. And you mentioned that TSET was a part of that, right? Increases in shop fees and some other stuff. So TSET is really a tiny drop in the bucket out of all of that. Is any of that stuff still on the table? And if not, why not?
Yes, I would assume so. To be real honest with you, I haven't had a lot of communication over the interim from the executive branch. I know they've been working on a lot of things. I've made my displeasure with that known. And so I don't know exactly. I mean, they're kind of do it on their own right now. The Healthcare Authority has a lot of, I guess, leeway and authority in promulgating their own rules. And so I haven't seen everything that they have on the table, but I would assume they wouldn't reinvent the wheel completely, and they're using many of those funding mechanisms. I mean, I'm sure SHOP is still going to be used as a funding mechanism, but this, you know, if everything was really neat and easy, it would be great, but it's not, because if you start messing with SHOP, the Supplemental Hospital Offset Payment Program, if you start messing with that's a big deal. It's a big deal for hospitals, and you get to the point where it's either raise taxes, as was mentioned earlier, or you go looking for other revenue streams. And the lesser of two evils is, in my mind, is maybe using some TSET money and not damaging their corpus, rather than going full blown after SHOP, which definitely our hospitals will bear the cost of that. And so, I mean, there's nothing that
they'll revolt.
That's really clean.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to.
Well, and I think you raised an important. Yeah. Well, I think you raised an important point that I hope that our listeners are taking away as well. That TSET is an example of one of many different funding streams and trusts that fund different programs in the state. And so there's a lot of things to consider when we talk about where we're going to pull funding sources from to fund different needs. And then when we do make changes in different funding sources, there's always a downside to what it will impact. And so one example, I appreciate you bringing up is what will happen if you change SHOP funds and how that would impact hospitals. So,
yeah, and I'm sure that the governor is going to be going after SHOP funds. We have a statutory maximum of 4%. The federal statutory maximum is 6% of SHOP. Right now, I think the hospitals are about 2.9%. Every percentage point of SHOP is about $75 million. And so that is another avenue. So we've got, if you look at this really simply, you've got 50 million coming from TSET if 814 passes. You have probably another 50 from TSET, another 60 from premium taxes. And then if you use that 1% of SHOP and the hospitals agreed to it, then you're there on preliminary estimates. And then we just all hold our breath and see what the enrollment numbers look like.
Representative McIntyre, can you explain real quick what SHOP is for everybody who is not as
Sure.
well versed in this as you are?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. So SHOP is a program. It's almost every state has it. It's called something different in every state. We call it SHOP. And basically, Medicaid reimburses at such a low rate. It's lower than Medicare. Medicare is considered the upper payment limit. And so what SHOP does is SHOP comes in behind. The hospitals basically assess themselves a bed tax. It's matched with federal matching funds. And then it's sent back to Oklahoma and redistributed to the hospitals quarterly. And what this does is it brings up all of the healthcare services they've performed given to Medicaid patients, and it acts as an extra payment, if you will, to get hospitals to that upper payment limit, which is Medicare rates. And so that's all it does, because the hospitals lose money on every Medicaid patient they see. And so this gets them up to the Medicare rate. I hope that makes sense. That's as simple as I think as I
Totally. 100%.
It's such a great example, though, of like the complicated nature of healthcare funding, federal funding, and the intersection of all this stuff, right? Where it's so rarely is it just like, this organization gives money to this group. It's always like, well, they take some and they take some and it routes back up and then they add some more to it and then it comes back down. You're like, that sounds made up.
One other
every day.
Yeah.
One other question that I've heard come up in relationship to the state question is that is the money earmarked in any sort of way? Like, is this money that has to be used for Medicaid expansion or other healthcare expenses, or does this go into general revenue and can be appropriated for whatever?
And then we keep our fingers crossed that the legislature will use it for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they will, as long as I'm overseeing the health budget, because I will cry out. And that's what I do for your listeners who don't know who I am. I'm the A&B chairman for health, so I do the budget for health. Earmarks. Now we can get back into policy here. Are earmarks good policy? I would say they're not. I understand why taxpayers want earmarks, though. Earmarks, a taxpayer says, okay, if you're going to take my taxes, my hard-earned money, then we want to know where you're spending it. And so there's been, throughout the last, I would say it's been the whole time. People want to see money earmarked, but it's terrible for budgeting. Nobody earmarks they earmark some of their budget for rent or whatever. But when we do
things
it,
happen all the time. Yeah.
But you have, the brakes go out on the car, or you get a flat tire and you got to go get some more money somewhere. Well, I've got it earmarked for rent, so I can't use that. So I'm just not going to drive a car. No, nobody does that. Nobody does that. And state government shouldn't do that either. But I understand people really desire certainty, and they want to know where their taxpayer dollars are going. In this case, the money is not earmarked. You have pretty much the word of the legislature, however good that is, that money will be used for Medicaid. And honestly, our backs are against the wall because we don't have enough money, and we're going to have it, and it's going to go to Medicaid. It will go to provide matching funds. We're going to turn that $50 million into $100 million. Well, actually, 9-1. It's going to be times 9.
That's a pretty solid deal.
Yeah, it really is. And you know, the thing is, I know that some people are upset about, you know, maybe TSET is going to be impaired in some way, and they probably will be impaired a small amount. But it's a change. It's one they will figure out. It's one that the state will figure out. And while I don't believe it's completely optimal at this point, I'm still scratching my head saying, where are we going to get all this money? And it is a pretty attractive opportunity for the state.
Yeah.
Well,
Representative McIntyre, thank you for your time. I think we all know
You're
that this spring is going to be a difficult session in lots of ways, right? We'll still be dealing with COVID. The budget is certainly still a factor. And, you know, we've talked in the last few weeks to folks, you know, about everything from changes to Open Meeting Act to redistricting to budgeting, lots of things that are popping up. And we don't even know what the governor's going to say in his State of the State address in February. Who knows?
I have no idea. Usually,
Well,
we
still have 2 months of the year left, right? Or 2 or 3.
I'm laying down my claim right now that at some point the governor's State of the State address is going to include safe, responsible, and data driven. That's my I'm laying down that marker in the sand that'll happen.
We'll put that on our Predictorama.
Too, and
yeah,
well, you know, Top 10 State will be there as well. I don't know. It's going to be a really hard session. You're right, Anthony. There's a lot of changes that are coming down the pipe at Oklahomans, you know, from Medicaid expansion, police reform. I mean, there's all, you know, criminal justice reform. It is going to be a wild and crazy session. And it's going to be really interesting to watch this freshman class grow as legislators, because they've really only had one session, like real session, and it was pretty much a cakewalk. And then COVID happened, and I'm not counting that. But it's going to be interesting to watch them blossom and become legislators, and I'm excited about it. I think we have a fairly centrist right House now, and so I'm excited that we can actually work together and get some stuff done.
We're excited to watch it.
Yeah, I'm sure you are. So you guys have me back on, and I'll give you an update.
Right.
We'll do it.
You know, I
We'll
just
do
tell it like it is. So
that's very true. Hey, thank you so much, Representative. We appreciate it.
Yes,
you're welcome. Thank you, folks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. All right. Well, on that note, always pleasant speaking with Representative McIntyre. I appreciate that he takes our pointed questions in stride, and then continues to come back on the show.
I think we were really nice.
I didn't say we weren't nice. All right. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I've got some. Well, I was going to say I've got some stuff to digest about State Question 814. I already voted. I know how I voted. I'm not going to tell you, but I hope that this has been helpful
this is a great episode for people to go back and listen to, because we talked about a lot of great information about what TSET does, the impact that the state question will have, but also where the legislature is positioned to be in this 2021 session. And so there's a lot of things that the voters are going to have to weigh out, and this is a good episode to go back and listen to.
Yeah. I am working on getting some folks from the 805 campaign, the Yes on 805, and I think there's a No on 805 campaign now, which is the other state question. And so we'll try to get those folks scheduled for next week, ideally, to talk through that state question as well. This is tough. Like, I know the League of Women Voters, their annual voter guide is going to print like this week. But because everyone's voting, or so many people are voting by mail, it feels like we're late, right? Even though election day is not for another month.
Well, and so also the election board released some of the ballots earlier than normal because of so many people wanting to vote early. And so typically ballots would go out around this time, but they went out maybe a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago max. And so that's pretty unusual, but it's an unusual time where we're going to have a record number of people voting by mail. So I
got a Zoom call on Sunday talking about like ballot and the state questions and where people can go to get their information. People are digging in, man.
That's a great thing. It's a great thing.
Update on just a little bit of national stuff. The latest I've seen is that the president is fatigued, but otherwise in good spirits. I find this interesting just for a bunch of reasons. He has been given a single 8-gram dose of a drug by Regeneron. It's a polyclonal antibody cocktail. I understand it's a mix of 3 different antibodies these are synthetic antibodies that have been manufactured to combat coronavirus. This is something that doesn't have any FDA. It's kind of an emergency authorization from the FDA. It does not have an emergency. It does not have an approval. It's a drug that has shown some positive effects in patients that are hospitalized. So apparently the president is being treated with that. So that's the latest on President Trump and coronavirus.
There we go. It will undoubtedly change before I have a chance to edit this and get it posted. So, okay. Well, on that note, Bailey, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andy.
Scott, thank you as well.
Wouldn't miss it for the world.
Viewers, if you're watching this on Facebook or on YouTube, please know that we cross-post to both platforms. So if you want to share it on Twitter, it's on our easy ways that it's on our YouTube channel. But the video will remain on Facebook as well. If you want to share it there, please do. And also, this will be posted as a podcast to the Let's Pod This podcast the feed. That's what it's called, right? A feed. And so if you listen to podcasts, you can find it anywhere: Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all of those podcast places. You can also find a link to it directly on our website, which is letsfixthisok.org. Ooh, listeners, I have not told you, you can now just go to letsfixthis.org. So if you forget the OK, we... thanks to a generous donor, we were able to secure that domain, which is a big deal. So that's nothing else is changing right now, but just throwing that out there. Even if you misspell it, you can still find it. All right. Well, on that note, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Let's Pod This is a production of Let's Fix This. It is produced by Bailey, Scott, and me. We're a member of the Mostly Harmless Media Network, which is based right here in Oklahoma City and home of some other really excellent podcasts that you should check out. And our theme music that you heard briefly in the intro, and then if you're listening, you'll hear it on the outro as well, is called Rhino Funk. It's a song by an artist named So Down. And on that note, have a great week, everybody.